I'm scrambling to think of a good medical story, being an old spy.
All right. Mike, thank you for being here. As someone who started and ran the CIA Leadership Academy, you retired as CIA's chief of HR and have a new book out, Certainty, on helping, bosses and leaders lead. But kind of taking a step back, I would love to start with, could you take me through maybe a moment in your time at CIA or training or personal story where, a failure had real consequences and how that's kind of rolled into your current path in life?
Sure, that's great. I'm scrambling to think of a good medical story, being an old spy,
Yeah.
right? But one time I was at CIA, I got a call. My father had been in a car accident, and so in Georgia, in Alabama. So I jumped in my car, went down there, and got there late. And this was 25 years ago, so this is pre-GPS. So got lost getting to the hospital. I'm stressed out. And then what happens, there's something called predictive storytelling, narratives that you tell yourself. So I'm predicting, oh my gosh, I'm going to get to the hospital. I'll get no help whatsoever. The doors will be locked. So I finally get there. It's about midnight. And lo and behold, the doors are open. So their story number one disappeared. And then I'm thinking, well, lights are off in this big atrium. I'll never find anybody. And then lo and behold, I hear this voice way in the back. Can I help you? And this young woman came out. And now I'm doing the predictive thing of, well, I'll never get to see him because it's after visiting hours. And so we started talking, and this woman was delightful. She looked up my father, found out that he was in intensive care, but in good shape. And so I'm getting ready to leave, come back in the morning, and she said, would you like to see him? Isn't that amazing? I mean, the service level just blew me away because 25 years ago, you didn't have that. So I stayed there for about 3 days, and then had to get back to the CIA. And what happens to your mind? Your mind leaves the ICU, and it's all on your problems back home. So I'm thinking about all that stuff, and I'm walking out this long arcade, and I hear this little voice that says, "Hi, Mr. Mears," and I look up, and it's that angel that helped me earlier. And then she said, "How's your dad?" And I will never forget that moment. This woman was such a natural at customer service, right? So I told a friend this story, and he looked it up. Turned out it was called the East Alabama Medical Center, and it was one of the top 5 hospitals in the United States. And we started doing research, and it was because the hospital director had such immense people skills. Everybody loved him. I ran into all the nurses I talked to. They loved him, and everybody loved their job. The place really hummed. And so I guess that, what I came up with was, could you have predicted that at that hospital? And I suppose if you'd had a psychological assessment of her and the hospital administrator, you would know you're going to a good hospital, but that doesn't happen in life. And so I've been working ever since on, okay, well, how could we predict better organizations, better institutions? What could we do? Basically that's what I've been working on for the last 19 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
And how did that, I would love kind of, paralleling that, what that story really encompasses is the service archetype. We call this a lot in our work. And
Yeah.
people that work in intelligence, your line of field, or medicine, or, they have a service archetype of serving, and they'll often give and give and give in the work that they do. And that can always, take a toll, which I would posit, but I definitely correct me if I'm wrong. In your work in CIA with starting a leadership academy, where did that need really kind of come from in your line of work? What problems were arising that you needed to
Well, it's
start
interesting.
to shift into? Yeah.
Yeah, here's something I bet you don't know. Here's a cocktail tidbit for you.
Okay.
So who do you think invented psychological assessments? When you go,
Yeah.
you take StrengthsFinder 2.0,
Yeah.
or you take some What would be your wild guess of who invented that?
I know it from the psychological assessments that come from burnout. I know those came from assessing, well, psychologists that were assessing essentially drug culture early days. And they
Okay,
were,
so that would probably 60s, right?
yeah, 60s. It was a lot with the movements that came. You saw a lot more people volunteering, protesting, and going into service missions. Yeah.
So this is, I've got a surprise for you. It was CIA.
Oh, wow. I mean, yeah.
And the reason why it was actually the OSS, which is the CIA's predecessor, right?
And what is that for the person? Let's say someone doesn't know what that is.
Office of Strategic Services. So later, and then it converted into becoming CIA in the late 40s. But the interesting thing was it was 1943, and the psychologist went to General Donovan, who headed it up. And their problem was talk about high stress work environments. They were parachuting people into Germany and France, teams of usually 3 people, and they were having a lot of these teams breaking up, either always because of stress. So they had nervous breakdowns, what they called it then, or bad leadership or whatever. So the psychologists at OSS went to General Donovan in August of 43, and they said, Chief, we think that if we leave our Jungian, Freudian baggage outside the door, we could come up with a way to assess people that will predict future behavior. He saw the immediate need and said, go do it. Well, the Germans were also trying to do it. And the reason is, just think, if you could get the right people in the right slots during warfare, what a leg up that would be against your enemies. And then the Brits were trying to do it. And all 3 efforts were top secret.
And what do you mean by the right slots? Is that like getting the right teams together?
Yeah, if you asked me to be a nurse and I were 50 years younger, I couldn't do it. And the reason is my empathy levels are too low, So throw me out in the wild and let me take huge risks and,
Yes.
and leave me alone for 6 months, and then we'll meet and I'll tell you what I've done. I love that environment. Whereas nursing, obviously, you've got to have a certain level of empathy, and it shows, right, when you're dealing with patients. So there's so many elements of both personality or traits, or euphemistically we call them talents now, that you're very happy in a job where you can really play to your strengths. It's the whole Gallup approach. So as a nurse, I would be miserable, and my patients would be miserable too. So they started working on these assessments, and went to the place called we call a farm, and they hammered out how would you do a leadership assessment. And then 4 weeks later, they rented an old estate near in Northern Virginia, and they ran the first OSS class through. And then in 1948, they published a book called An Assessment of Men meaning women and men, because there are a whole lot of women involved. And it blew the world of psychology away. And that's what we have in really good organizations that do assessments up front, both for employees, but only a handful do this for leaders.
Yeah.
Right? So we have a tendency to pick the best leader who's the best technician, has the best technical skills, but we're not looking at those people skills. You really want to have both of those.
Kind of pulling that thread a little bit. For, one of the phrases in your book that really stuck with me, in this book of certainty, is that when leadership is aligned with human nature, we move beyond wishful thinking. And, you have a variety of different frameworks. But I'm curious, what did that look like for you in your previous line of work? Like, where did you see that quote live or break in your environments?
Well, what's interesting is, first off, obviously human nature doesn't change. We're all different, but we share all the same drives, and we share all the same cognitive biases and emotions as a human race. So that's a constant. So it doesn't matter what organization you're in, you're going to see how you motivate people is pretty much going to be a constant. People are motivated by intrinsic motivators like sense of purpose, look at the medical profession, or for CIA, a higher good that you're working toward to help push along, sense of accomplishment for some people. Those are the big things that really motivate us. But then when you get to organizations, especially HR departments, will always go for extrinsic rewards, which are your bonuses and increase in pay and that kind of thing. So it's like you could look at two gears. One of them is, what do we do in organizations, organizational approaches, we'll call it, management, leadership, all that stuff. And then you've got another gear, which is human nature, and they don't mesh. And that's a major issue. So if you can redesign or redo how you handle all these leadership and management approaches just to fit human nature, it doesn't cost anything. It's not like there's an investment required, but it has phenomenal impact on people's sense of well-being, their performance levels, morale, everything.
Yeah, that's phenomenal. And, I want to talk, jumping off that point, in the framework you mentioned. So that the framework, the 3 steps, is selecting the right people, training and reinforcing key behaviors, equipping leaders with practical tools for high pressure environments. Right. Could you kind of walk through what is, if you were to really talking to whether a nurse that's leading, rounding their people every day, or thinking about, healthcare is a very dynamic space. There's
Right.
a lot of turnover. There's personnel you currently have. There's those team environments. But what I find really interesting about your framework is there's all these unpredictable challenges in that, which I'm sure is the same in your previous line of work. But when you're managing kind of new hires, people coming into positions, could you kind of walk through, each one of those steps and kind of break down how that could potentially be helpful in a healthcare setting?
Yeah, I think first off, I would guess that healthcare industry does a very good job of selecting pretty much the right people for the right positions. But that's a crucial element, because especially on the management side, there was a study done a while back from the conference board in DC, where they took a look at bad bosses in heading up a unit. And what they discovered is that if after the bad boss leaves for up to 5 years, that unit is hobbled. Isn't that amazing? I mean, think about it. So you got a bad boss, and therefore your performance is lower and people are more stressed. But then the boss leaves, and that remains. And the reason is it's a microculture. Basically, the boss has created a microculture in that unit, and that'll tend to stick around. So if you don't select your leaders with pretty high statistical validity, you can actually measure this validity coefficients, then you're gonna have that problem of the bottom 25% of those leaders are going to be creating huge amounts of problems. And then after 2 years, if you move them, now you've got 2 units hobbled, right? Yeah. And then another 2 years you move them. So you've got one bad boss can affect 3 times what you think they could affect. So that is step one is so very, very important. It's just to make sure you look for people skills and your technical skills if you want them, those together. And then secondly, get your validity up on your selection, which means you'd use structured interviews by a professional, or you'd use psychological assessments or something to make sure you root out the autocrats and micromanagers and those types of people. So CIA uses it on the front end. They have an extensive assessment process, as you can imagine. You go through psychological assessments. You go through pen and paper tests, and then you talk to psychiatrists. You get a polygraph, and I mean, on and on, in addition to the other normal interviews. Very long process, but they've got to try to weed out the narcissist and the near psychopaths, obviously, out of that business. But all I'm saying is take a shorter version of that and just make sure you check who's going to be your frontline manager, who's going to be a manager, who are your executives.
And then for the kind of following on that, because some things you can see is, you can walk very clearly sometimes when you're shadowing in these environments, you can see those cultures. And for the ones that are, in it, or potentially there's a particular unit where there's not a lot of trust in the team, how do you approach from a behavior lens point? Like, let's say you have to take someone who is already in the system, they have a key role, and
Right.
in many ways in healthcare, if someone's output is very impressive, that's the top of the it's an RVU system in the sense of it's like surgical teams, how many surgeries they're putting out, and all these things, and they can be a very effective person, but culture could still be damaged in other ways or have peripheral effects.
Exactly.
So for those type of people that are still providing that value, that maybe, this is where training is so important. They might have not had that training. And Jess was even walking through in the nursing environment, the importance of training performance and recovery and culture. How do you, on the point of training and reinforcing key behaviors, how do you take someone that is having those struggles, and what are some of the first things that you would recommend to them?
Well, it's interesting. I did a study while I was at the agency of anonymously collecting information on 200 really great leaders, and basically would interview employees. So if you had to say you've got one measure of how do you measure good leadership, you would want a whole suite of things to do that. But if you only could pick one, pick what the employees say about that leader, right? So I picked 200 and then extracted from employees, okay, well, why are they a great leader? And I got this list of 70 attributes. None are very helpful because they were trustworthy, they had integrity. And those are all valid, but they're platitudes and they're not actionable. So we had to go below that, and we said, what are the behaviors of those best leaders? And that's where it really got interesting, because it collected a huge number of very small behaviors. And then we took it and clumped them, trying to figure, okay, this set of behaviors builds psychological safety. So we're going to put that there. And then this set of behaviors kind of follows the law of reciprocity in psychology and anthropology, and we'll put those in the trust building category. And then there's another set of behaviors that are, just having idle conversations, chit chat with people, open conversations, active listening. Okay, well, that goes into the clarity, make clarity a part of it. And then we looked at these things, and it was interesting that step one kind of is to establish psychological safety with people if you're the boss, or even in relationships, right? And that's all the basic stuff. That's again, active listening, saying hello to people in the morning. I mean, how hard is that? Smiling at people. It's just this little suite of leadership 101 stuff, and then you have to do that before you can establish trust. That's what we found. So step two is kind of then establish trust. And that's, trust is like influence. They're both a part of me giving you little gifts, or giving you currencies, some people call them, repeatedly, consistently. So you like information, so periodically I'll send you a note with some data. Or I can give you some occasional praise. That might be it. Or I can give you some work that stretches you that you like. So this continuous gift giving periodically really builds trust together. And by the way, in the spy business, that's what we do. We trick people abroad into giving us secret documents, and it sort of follows that pattern of initial, make yourself not fearsome. Step two is long period of establishing trust to get, say, this Russian to bring secret documents to you. Follows somewhat the same pattern, because again, we're people, it's human nature, right?
Yeah. On that note, one of the examples you give in the book, and this one really stood out to me because the way you described it was it's very analogous to some of the aspects of healthcare, was the case example of Renee.
Oh, interesting.
Of the sense that, and maybe it would be useful to just like even give a kind of backstory of that. But you talk about the stuff she was doing in Afghanistan, where you're on 24/7. And some of these shifts or, emergency response incidents, we were at a conference where, a couple health systems were talking about their hurricane responses and how that has acts. And to a certain extent, you become in a similar way, the way it's described in both, it seems very similar to me because you're on 24/7. There's this load. And that's where, almost leaders are tested the most in their ability to still do the things that you're recommending. But could you maybe walk through, that Renee story and what made her such an effective leader?
It was very interesting. She's a remarkable lady, and actually wouldn't let me use her real name in the book.
Yeah.
So I called her Renee. But she was in a extraordinarily intense wartime situation, and you're trying to conduct intelligence operations to find out things about the bad guys, terrorists, and so on. And she had a team, inherited a team that was a little bit gun shy, and that they'd had a bad boss, and she just basically naturally, about 8% of people who are tested are natural leaders, and she was one because she had a real drive to improve an organization working through people, and that's really crucial, first among equal. But then she had the empathy to offset the drive naturally, and that keeps you from being an autocrat. She's positive outlook, which is really important in leadership too. You don't want people who are pessimist or negative, that they're not going to be able to motivate or rally people. She's a learner, meaning that she would also listen very intently to other people. So people, even when we're in a leadership, when we're in an employee role, we really crave having a little piece of the pie. We know we can't control things. We're not executives or anything, but could we get a little bit of good work, not just dumping delegation, but really good work that stretches us? And that's what she was masterful at. So she took this team that a little bit beaten down, and discovered pretty quickly what are their strengths of each one, because they're very different. And then she started really pushing them, after she'd established the psychological safety and the trust, she started pushing them in the direction of their strengths to get things done. And it was really miraculous, the production of this group during the time she was there. Just absolutely went asymmetric. And
on that, I'm curious because one of the things is a common question when you think of any of this type of work, because it can be, there's always studies that show the data of, the importance of having it in a team. But one of the things, even in healthcare, they're always interested in like, what's the outcome in efficiency, or what's the outcome in all these other things that aren't necessarily the immediate outcome, which you see like a team's now thriving together. But what was the outcome in that situation that, as a result of her leadership?
That's one of those rare ones where we actually had a direct measure.
Really? Okay.
And so under Renee, it improved 30% over the previous boss.
Wow.
And the group's doing exactly the same thing.
And so the node was that when Renee came in, it was very clear to see in
very clear.
the change.
And part of it was because I only know two of the people that were on her team, but I talked to them later. And it was very interesting that one of them said to me, well, Renee, let us be creative.
Mm.
Isn't that interesting? And because they were being more creative, one thing they did was, you can imagine government and army and military and CIA, that they're silos, right? But one thing that she was able to do, because of this sense that we control our own destiny and Renee will let us think big thoughts, is they started knitting together all these organizations, and they formed a phenomenal, I don't want to call it a command center, but it was a cross-disciplinary center looking at terrorist threats. So actually the good in her organization grew sideways, and they had the phenomenal increases in performance. People started sharing things, trusting each other across the boundaries.
Yeah, that's phenomenal. And so on that story, kind of threading that needle, what would your advice be? Let's say you're a leader. A lot of these EDs got I'll give a prime example. Hurricane Helene came this past fall, and the responses in the community and the emergency response, a lot of these ERs got swamped with a lot of, and even just the commands that were supporting it, and in a variety of different healthcare ways. What's one thing, either a tool you could give to a leader today to support their team in crisis?
It's really interesting. West Point did a study, and they found that if you're, for example, in combat or in an extreme situation where a lot of the things I was talking about, establishing safety and being trustworthy and so forth, temporarily shifts so that the number one attribute you look for if you're in combat with your sergeant or your lieutenant is competence. Isn't that interesting? So the important thing I would say is be competent in your discipline, because they'll certainly be looking for that in the medical field during those crisis periods. But the other part is, even though that's just a temporary period of an emergency reaction, and then what's the most important thing after that is the trust you've established with people, right? It goes back to that. So you have to bank the psychological safety and the trust building and those behaviors, before the crisis hits, and then make sure your competence is at the appropriate level,
Yeah.
right? So people don't get fearful, and then you're back to the normal situation. So
One thing building off that I'm curious to get your take on, where it can be a bit of a challenging question. I'll challenge you on this in healthcare, is that when they get these assessments, whether it's trust in leader or the things that they'll deploy, if it's a wellness department, it'll be, an annual survey. They spend a lot of time trying to get people to fill out the survey.
right,
Sometimes they'll use incentives. Sometimes it ends up being like a 60-question survey. And even we're at a conference and it ranged from anywhere from a 10-question survey to a 16-question survey. But on top of that, let's say you deploy this information and get this information. That information might not be analyzed for another 2 months, and then acted on, if at all acted on, in some domains in 6. Now, Stanford does a really good job of their WellMD program and thinking about how do they action this. We've had people on network where they do things like changing AHRs and understanding tempo and all those things. But in a system where your measure of these things can be actually so far removed, where like an ED in the summer might be very different than tempo-wise, or their problems vary.
right.
What do you think is a solution to tackling that feedback loop of the things that you're suggesting?
What I found too, it's even worse than what you described, because in many cases, they do the surveys, organizations will do the surveys, and then the information is late, but then not acted on or not reviewed appropriately. So one way around that, and I'll give you one measure that's a miracle measure I found, and I'm working with Gallup on this, is, we've all got, we're social animals, so we're very attuned to signals from other people. And so the things that really disturb us, and you can see this on MRIs with the neuroscientists, but the things that really disturb us are something that happens and we're experiencing uncertainty, or we experience something we think is unfair, or there's some perceived change in our relationships with other people. So these are the type of things that really make the brain go haywire. And when that happens, they call it social pain, these strong emotions, when it happens, your ability to be creative or the ability to concentrate or be logical kind of goes out the window. So what I found, I did a study at a place called the Savannah River Site, which is one of the 16 national labs. They called me to do they wanted to know, what are our employees thinking? And so I used some focus groups, but some people you got to take out for a couple of beers to get them to open up. And what were their employees thinking? Because they kept giving their employees more information, and the employees kept complaining, we don't get enough communications. It's driving them crazy. Well, it turns out the reason was all the employees wanted to know was not who's coming in for a plant visit that day. They want to know, how am I doing, boss? Do my colleagues respect me? Is there anything coming down the pike, like a big reorganization or something that could harm me that I should know about? It's that just that basic human stuff that is always there. And if you don't answer that with your employees, it creates this pretty significant angst over time. And here's something, if I had my life to live over again, what I would do was I would have increased the praise I gave my employees eightfold. I used to think, oh, my A players and B players, they know they're good. Why should I give them praise every day? And I'm actually, like I say, I'm working with Gallup on this. I think if you could praise every employee once a week, give them some kind of recognition one-on-one, that it appears that all of this angst goes away. So I don't have to have a meeting with you every day and say, Joshua, geez, you're doing a great job. Our relationship is good.
Yeah.
You're respected by your peers. I don't have to go through that. I just say, Joshua, I just wanted you to know that, that presentation you gave yesterday was fantastic, and it really linked what we're doing here to the mission above. You did a super job. Well, you'll go home maybe and tell a spouse about that one. That's when you know you've rung a bell. And what happens is, again, all those angsty questions that are there inside unconsciously in our brain kind of disappear for about a week. So that's why I say probably weekly praise is really an amazing antidote for this psychological stress. Now, the problem is, what if you don't know as a boss what somebody did good that week? Because that's possible, because you don't see them working. Well, just ask a question like, Joshua, what are you proudest of this week? And then you'll come back with something that I didn't know as a boss. And I say, oh, gosh, I'm really proud. That's wonderful. I'm glad you did that. Thank you. You see what I mean?
Yeah,
There's ways to ferret it out, but it's such a small human thing. Again, it works at CIA. I've done this at State Department in the last year. We set this system up of, we call it check-ins, where you could just once a week, less than a 5-minute meeting with an employee. A little chit-chat. How are you doing? What can I help you with? What are you proudest of this week? That kind of stuff. Less than 5-minute meeting, and it just takes all that sting away. And it'll work in the medical profession as well. Adobe does it. And actually, I worked for GE for 9 years. And Jack Welch started that by getting rid of this annual survey stuff that was terrible, because people live in uncertainty for a year, and then you get hammered with this
Yeah, and you
annual
don't
review.
act on it.
Oh my goodness, the worst thing you could do to people mentally. So he junked it in 92, 93, and I was so relieved, because I detested those things. And he didn't really implement check-ins per se, but he just said bosses should talk more frequently on a casual basis and positively with employees.
So what I'm hearing is really like it's a matter of instilling that in the environment. So in medicine, it might be when you round, or when you're doing those check-ins with your teams, finding ways to kind of loop that in. Now, the last thing I want to kind of conclude on is, what do you feel like is a really, for the the leader that might be closed off to this, if you could give them one quote that might shake them up, or bring them the reason to the importance of all these things, like what would you, and you looking back in your career, you gave some notes of the things that you wish you did more of,
Right.
but kind of closing off, what advice would you have for that hospital leader leading an ER or a ICU?
Well, let me give two, because the first one, going back to the check-ins, is you want to put accountability into the system too, so that people do change their behaviors. So back to your metrics question, you can't scrap your 70 questionnaire. I'd love to see that go out the window, but what you could do is implement every 60 days a 1 or 2 question survey, a little pulse survey. And one of those questions would be, my boss has given me positive feedback in the last 2 weeks, or week or month. And that way, that gives the manager an overall view of, well, 25% of our managers did it a year ago, and now we're up to 30. That's good. That's good because you're building those positive
Accountability,
reserves,
yeah.
right? So absolutely. And, the best advice is something I'm working on too, still, is self-awareness. It looks like the more we think we're self-aware, the less self-aware we actually are. And so for fun, I would just have everybody get on Google and Google in cognitive bias list. And this thing on Wikipedia pops up of over 200 of these crazy cognitive biases we have. And a lot of them are sort of one-way biases. Like, I'll give you an example. If you're a manager, you think that people are motivated by money. And I've done this myself 3 times. I ran this at CIA. Managers will say, what motivates people? Money. And then you ask the employees, and what they say motivates them is recognition. So what happens there? Is that a brain switch that goes off? No, it's called an attributional bias, where I think I'm motivated by recognition. I want it. But when I look at you, I think you're motivated by money. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, that's
So
phenomenal.
these are great little, just read pop literature on some of these cognitive biases, and it kind of gets your head straight about, who you are and possible blind spots that you have.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Mike, and thank you
Yeah.
for your service.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Great.